I just wanted to show you some different types of boning. In the Middle Ages, women wore tightly laced bodies that were stiffened with like a paste to control their figures. In the 16th century, whalebone became more popular and a common material to shape people's bodies. It's also known as baleen. Whalebone, it's not a bone, it's the keratinous material found around the upper jaw of whales, and they use it to filter out the plankton in the krill. So it's really robust and flexible. It's a bit like your nail. So it's flexible. When it's cold, it's more brittle, and once it warms up against the body, it becomes more flexible. So these are two different types of whalebone. You probably won't very hard to get hold of this now, or even so you would struggle to find it. So these are just pieces in different widths. So you can see they split it down the lengthwise, so it's quite flexible. It almost feels like the Perspex. So, and this is thinner pieces, and they kind of laced them together with threads, like braided the thread around it to make a wider piece. So that's real whalebone. Then in the 17th century, the whalebone linings became more distinct and separate understructures known as stays. The word corset wasn't used in the modern sense until like early 1800s, when corsetry and the pronounced hourglass figure it created became like dominant in fashion. So the equivalent to, because you can't get the whalebone anymore, or synthetic version is this. So it comes in different widths. It's called synthetic whalebone. You can get it at Vina Cava. And it's not quite, it's a little bit softer than the whalebone, but the whalebone, once it warms up, softens. Once it picks up the body heat, it gets softer. So this is more like probably what it is once it's warmed up. And it comes in different widths. So yeah, that's the modern day version of whaleboning. So this is what they replaced it with. So steels. These are steel spirals. They come in different widths, different lengths. You can get them on a reel and buy the caps separate and cut your own lengths and saves a lot of wastage. Pop the caps on the ends. So they can bend sideways. Very flexible, very strong. And then you can buy this Perspex, which is what you will have in your packs. This is what we're going to be using for our samples. This is 10mm wide. It comes in different widths as well. So this is a Perspex boning. The other types of boning are, this is flat steels. So they're quite thin. They're very nice. They're enameled on either end. The only problem with them, you need to know what lengths exactly that you need, because you can order them in the lengths. Because if you try cut these, they become really sharp and lethal, so you'd have to grind them down and then re-enamel the end. So you'd have to buy a variety of lengths, or else know exactly what your lengths are prior to purchasing them. So they're flat steels. And then there's Ridgeline. You'll have some of this in your pack. I'm not a fan of Ridgeline. It has its uses. Because the problem with Ridgeline, once you use it in a dress or anything, once that person gets a crick in it, like bending over, that's there all the time, and then it won't ever sit back the way it was. What it is good for, you can strip it down. So I've stripped it down here a little bit, and you can see these little, it's a series of little Perspex pieces. So you can strip them down and pull them out, and these are really good for making feathers, using as the you know, the stem down the middle of the feather, or using for millinery, making flowers. So it's good for that, to strip down and use it for other different things that you could make, decorations. Yeah. The problem with this as well, once you use it, other than the bending, you have to you can buy caps for it, or else you can melt it with a lighter. These start poking through and start stabbing the person wearing it. So I'm not a fan of using this for corsetry. It's not strong enough. You can fold it in half. That makes it a bit stronger, and then use it that way. But still, again, you get that crick in it. You bend over and it's there permanently. You can't ever get rid of it. So that's my take on Ridgeline. So these are the variety. You can get these at various places. Klein's, Vinakova, Divines. You can order them online. Yeah. So taped on to the same boning channel. So you would do this inside your bodices. So the side seam has it taped onto the seam allowance. So you've popped a boning channel over the seam allowance, and you're just going to catch down the Petersham on either side, and then you would pop a bone in there. And there's no stitching on the outside, you just see the seam. So the machine line doesn't go through to the front, it just goes on to the seam allowance. Yeah. So how you do that is you get your normal seam allowance, you've overlocked it, and then you get yourself a piece of Petersham, and if you fold it in half, you can rub it along the edge of your table, fold it in half, and so you've created a crease. And then you pop it down the center of your seam allowance. So making sure that folded edge is sitting on the ditch. The ditch means where the two pieces of fabric come together to create the seam. It's called a ditch. So if you lay your Petersham down along that, and then you hand stitch it in place. So pop your needle in and make sure it's in the ditch, and just keep checking you're in the correct position. Single thread. And sew it in place. Just tuck it in place. And then this way, do that all the way along. This way it won't shift when you try to stitch it. And then what you'll do, you'll come along, you'll move the body of your fabric out of the way, so you're just machine stitching on the edge of your seam allowance. And this is one that's done previously. So you see I've stitched along there, and also on the other side, making sure that the body is out of the way. You just literally stitching on the seam allowance. You created a pocket, and then you can pop your boning into it. So that is a boning channel on the seam. So you'll mainly use this in bodices. So our next one is going to be on the seam but through to the front. So you'd mainly use this one on corsets. So you're stitching the Petersham down on both sides through to the front of the fabric. So you get a stitch line hopefully evenly either side. So you can make a feature out of it on your corsets because it will show through to the front, so you have to do it very neatly. So how you do that is you get your seam allowance, iron it really well, press it open, make sure it's completely open at the back, pressed, and then you would take the two sides and you need to cut the seam allowance down so that it fits underneath your Petersham tape. So like this, so it will sit so you can hide it. So it needs to be narrow enough so it's not peeping out either side of your Petersham. So you make sure you press open your seam before you cut down your sides, otherwise it's a bit tricky after the fact. So cut it down how wide you think. And if you put them two pieces together and cut them, I'll just do half of it. And make sure that that's going to fit underneath the Petersham. So that's narrow enough. So once you've done that, you get your Petersham. So like the previous one, you will fold it in half, so you've got a crease that you can line up with your ditch. And again, tack it in place with your needle and thread. So single thread on your crease, make sure it's in your ditch, and tack it so it doesn't shift on you. Yeah, and tuck it all in place. And then you would come and machine either side, like here. So you machine either side straight through to the front, and you're making a feature of it. So this is what you want more evenly. What you don't want, if you don't tack the Petersham in place, you end up like this, and then that's visible from the front of your corset, so it's going to look a mess. So don't skip the step of tacking your Petersham in place. And a little tip is when you're sewing the Petersham on, especially when you're doing your corsets, because sometimes you'll have 3 layers or your fabric might be a bit thick. You'll find with a normal foot and you come along sewing, it will tip down. So a little trick I use a zipper foot and on the inside, so it's not going to rock off, and stitch going down this way. And then on the other side you can swap your needle over and stitch that side. That helps. So that is sewn on the seam to the front, and it'll probably be one of the main ones you'll use for corset making. Yeah. So a flat felled seam can be used as a casing for your boning on corsets. So It can be quite decorative. You leave that on the front. You can do contrasting color threads and make a feature out of it. It looks quite nice. It also saves you money because you don't have to buy the Petersham. You're just encasing it in the fabric. So you make the width of where you join the seams together to where you fold the fabric over. That space between there needs to be the width of the boning. So you have to allow for measure the width of the boning and then how deep it is. So this one's quite shallow. This will just pop in. Usually leave like a millimeter either side. Will give you enough room. So you don't want it too loose and you don't want it too tight in there. Because when it becomes too tight, what happens, the fabric, when it's really tight, it will rub and start splitting after a while. So don't make them too tight. So you're popping your bone in and you're making a casing. So how you create that is make your seam allowance, add a little bit extra to accommodate for this folding the edge over. Press it open really well, both sides. Make sure this is completely opened up here. And then you come along and you trim one side down. And I usually trim the side down using it as a guide here about the width of your bone. So you end up like this, so one side shorter than the other. And then you can use this as a guide to wrap your fabric around and then lay it down and then you top stitch and you end up with that. So that's the top of it and that's the underneath of it. When you fold this over, if it's too wide and it's buckling here, trim it down. But when you trim it down, make sure you've got a good turn there. Don't go too short, because if you go too short and you're trying to turn it, it starts going wibbly wobbly because there's not enough to turn. You need a good turn there that when you stitch it's catching through the other side as well. Yeah, so if I cut this like this, really short, and I've only got that amount to turn around, it's really tricky to get a nice clean smooth line there. And then when you stitch you might actually miss some of it and it'll pop out. So make sure you got a good turn there. Yeah, it just makes your life easier. So that's how you do the flat felled casing. Yeah, there you go. So this is another way of pop and boning. Usually you use this on the center front of a bodice, or if you were doing single fabric, like just couture for your for a corset, you could make channels with this Petersham tape. So literally get it, and on the inside layer or on your single layer, you're stitching it. So how you do that is you just lay it on the fabric, you stitch up one side, stitch down the other, and then your boning can pop in there. So this is it where it's popped in. I've stitched this completely up to the top, and then I've done a little cross stitch here where you just want your boning coming up between the breasts. You don't want it higher than that or it will protrude out. So I've just done a little cross stitch across to stop it. You could just put your channel to there, or if you do this way you've got room to play with it. You can shift it up and down and then mark with a cross stitch where you want it to stop. So usually you see this on the center front of things, so it's on this, in this case it's literally just on the inside couture, and the middle fabric lining and the top fabric. It's not sewn to, so from the front of it you wouldn't see the channel. Yeah. So that's using Petersham as a channel. So this is a encase boning, and then it's herringbone onto the seam allowance. So how you prepare that is you get some Petersham, you fold it in half. You've got 2 layers, so you fold it in half and you machine it either side, so you're creating a little pocket. And then you can, this is 1/2 inch Petersham, then you can pop your boning in and it fits perfect. And then what you do with that, you lay it onto your seam allowance. Then with a double thread you will herringbone it in place, so going right across it. You can catch it a little bit onto the seam allowance through the Petersham if you want. Every now and again I do. You can just go straight across, back and forth. But every now and again I will catch the Petersham so it doesn't slip out. Yeah. And you hold it in place like that. This gets used on, say if you need some extra boning, you can pop it in after the fact this way. This is on the bodice here. It's being caught on the side front seam. It just gets caught down with your bias binding at the bottom. And if you catch it at the top so it doesn't slip up, if it's sort of within, it's going to stop short. If you're going to put it from top to bottom, it'll just get caught in the bias binding when you finish off. They use this a lot in tutu bodices because it's easy to take out. If the performer doesn't want it in there, they can just pull it out. Yeah, so that is encase boning, an encased piece of boning herringboned onto your seam allowance, so it's just on the seam allowance, yeah, not through to the front. So the sample is using Ridgeline if you're going to use it for boning. So you can lay it on the flat, just zigzag, you can literally just big wide zigzag over it and sew right through it. Just go a little bit slow with your machine, don't go too quick because it might snap your needle, but just take it easy and you can sew directly through it. And if you want to make it a bit stronger, you can just fold it in half and then wide as zigzag and zigzag over, depending. This is a wider width of Ridgeline, so the wider zigzag just catches in the soft bit there and goes across, so you can see it there. So that's Ridgeline. It's really simple to use. If you were using it for a channel, you would just literally stitch down either side. Yeah. So this is making boning channels just in case in the boning between 2 layers of fabric. So what you would do was figure out the width of your boning. This is 10 millimeters, and the depth. So I would make my channels about 12 millimeters. Should fit good with this. So I've just done a stitch line on the machine, left a 12 millimeter space and another stitch line, and then I can pop the bone in. And what you don't want, you can see it's good there, it's a little bit tight there, so you can see the edge. If it's, this isn't bad, but if it was really, really tight, what happens, you get wear and tear. So it's, after a while, this will start splitting here if it's too tight. So don't make them too loose and don't make them too tight. So this is a corset used. This method is used pretty well on most of it. So you've just made your channels and they popped the boning in. So it's just 2 layers of couture. And they've just made the channels the width of what to accommodate the boning that they're using. But that's a really simple boning channel. So this is another bodice. It's got quite a few of the boning that I just went through with you. So you can see this is encased between the 2 layers, but it's just blocked off there. You got some herringbone in a self-made casing. So in this case, I've made the casing out of calico, and then it's just been herringboned to the seam allowance. And on this seam allowance, it's been finished off with some bias binding made from the top silk. There's some more channels made just through 2 pieces of fabric, and this is also herringboned with a self-made casing, and you can see it's just caught down at the top there, and the bottom of it catches in the bias binding. Where this one here has been herringboned and it's caught at the top and bottom. And then the center front is just made with Petersham on the 1 layer. It's caught down underneath the bias binding at the bottom waist, and it's been cross-stitched across here to stop it going any further up. So that's some of the boning that you will come across. Yeah, they'd be the main ones we use. And that's boning for you.